In World War II, over 9 million men were taken as prisoners. Most never spoke about what happened behind the fences. Not because they forgot, because no one wanted to hear it. They weren't tortured with fire. They were tortured with time, with cold that crept into their bones, with silence that stretched for days. With food so scarce, men chewed leather, grass, and dirt just to stay upright. Their hands shook not from fear, but from weeks without real nourishment. Survival in these camps wasn't a matter of strength. It was a test of what you could give up before you lost yourself. Some learned to fake illness using lice. Others stole from the dying, weeping as they chewed what no man should eat. Most just stared through the wire, counting breaths and trying not to hope. Every day was a negotiation with death, not in battle but in waiting. There were no weapons, no orders, no glory. Just one rule: make it to tomorrow, no matter what it costs you. Today, we uncover 8 brutal truths from inside the camps. Real tactics, real horrors, exposed not by generals, but by the men who came back carrying silence in their eyes. These aren't just stories. They're quiet screams left out of the textbooks. If you think these truths deserve to be heard, hit like and subscribe, because history didn't record what it couldn't face. Number 1. Starvation engineering. In many World War II POW camps, especially those holding Soviet soldiers, starvation wasn't collateral damage, it was a tool of control. Rations weren't just scarce. They were calculated to weaken, demoralize, and break the spirit, just enough to keep the body moving, but never strong enough to hope. Daily bread? Sometimes as little as 700 calories. Barely enough for a child, much less a grown man standing guard or digging trenches. Some POWs received only sugar beet husks, straw flour, or unverified wartime inventions passed off as food. This wasn't starvation. This was starvation engineering. Every day, camp commanders forced men to burn more than their bodies could sustain. They scheduled labor shifts knowing men had no reserves left. They limited Red Cross parcel access to control who lived and who didn't. The result? POWs scavenged. They chewed grass, roots, even papers. Some hid moldy rations for later, trading time for survival. Others rationed worms, insects, even leather. Anything to keep hunger at bay for another hour. Men who survived did so because they learned the calculus of hunger, how long a crust could last, how many roots made a stew, how to steal seconds from death, one bite at a time. This wasn't about courage. It was about calculation. They adapted cognitively when physical reserves were gone. Every crumb, every sip, every scavenged root became survival variables in a cruel equation. And for some, solving that equation meant the difference between walking home and dying behind barbed wire. These weren't heroic stories. They were acts of improvised brilliance under extreme cruelty. If someone in your family once mentioned the silent ways they ate to survive, not for taste, but to stay alive, share it in the comments below. And if these hidden truths belong to history, hit like and subscribe, because before we can stand, we must remember how they endured. Number 2. War of sleep deprivation. In the prison camps of World War II, sleep wasn't rest, it was a threat. Soldiers learned quickly that closing your eyes for too long could mean never opening them again. In freezing huts with no insulation, on bare floors crawling with lice, sleep became a dangerous luxury few could afford. Roll calls came at all hours, sometimes 2-3 times a night. Guards would barge in, shouting, forcing men to stand in lines for hours, half-dressed, teeth chattering, eyes barely open. If someone stumbled or swayed, it wasn't always hunger, it was exhaustion, dragging them down like a weight they couldn't shake. And yet, they had to keep standing. Some prisoners developed strange habits just to fight the fatigue. They chewed on cloth or tapped their feet in rhythm. Others whispered songs under their breath, just to stay alert, to keep their minds moving. There were those who trained themselves to sleep sitting up, heads tilted just right so they wouldn't be caught. A few became experts at taking seconds-long naps, eyes open, heart racing, always listening. But this wasn't just about tiredness. Sleep deprivation was a tool, a quiet, cruel weapon that made men forget their names, forget where they were or why they still had to survive. Minds dulled, decisions slowed, hope faded. In time, it wasn't the cold or the hunger that broke most men. It was the slow unraveling of thought, the feeling that time didn't move, and neither did you. And in that stillness, the body begged for rest, but rest never came. So they adapted. They leaned on one another during standing counts. They memorized steps to stay grounded. Some would even hurt themselves, just to feel enough pain to stay awake. This wasn't strength, it was necessity. Because in a place where even sleep was taken away, the will to stay awake became its own kind of defiance. Number 3, the body was currency. In the frozen shadows of prison camps, nothing had fixed value. Food, warmth, mercy, they weren't guaranteed. They were traded, and the only thing every prisoner had left to bargain with was his own body. A man's coat, once part of his uniform, became leverage. If it still had buttons, it could be traded for soup. If it was lined with wool, it could fetch half a loaf of bread. If it wasn't stolen while he slept, it became his only shield against the cold. Shoelaces weren't just laces, they were rope, barter, sometimes even currency, for cigarettes smuggled in through guards. Even a working belt could mean the difference between dignity and desperation. But the trades didn't stop at clothing. A chipped tooth, if pulled and handed over to a desperate medic, could buy medicine, or something close to it. Old wounds were reopened to gain access to the infirmary, where rations were marginally better. Blisters, frostbite, infections, men learned to use their pain as proof. To prove weakness, to earn rest, to get food. Some learned to limp just slightly when guards were watching. Others bit down on their own hands to fake injury. Bruises, real or staged, became a language, a message. I can't work today. I need to stay behind. Those who looked too healthy were pushed harder. Those who looked too weak were left behind. So men walked a line, sick enough to be spared, strong enough to survive. It wasn't just manipulation. It was survival strategy. Over time, the camp's quiet economy became visible in gestures. A man tugging at his sleeve might be showing a burn. A pause before walking could mean an offer. A limp for half your bread. There were no words, only signals. Silent trades in a system built by suffering. In that world, your body was no longer yours. It was a tool, a bargaining chip, a thing you had to spend carefully, because once it was gone, you had nothing left to offer. Number 4, escape without leaving. Not every prisoner climbed a fence or crawled through a tunnel. Some never moved an inch, and still managed to escape. Inside the wire, freedom didn't come with open gates. It came through memory, through imagination, through a refusal to let the camp become all there was. Men scratched lines into the floor, each mark a day survived. Others carved makeshift calendars into wooden bunks, not to count time, but to claim it. Because when time wasn't yours, even tracking it felt like rebellion. One soldier used a torn shirt sleeve to draw maps in the dirt, not because he would escape, but because he remembered how. The roads, the rail lines, the rivers. Keeping them alive in his mind was his resistance. Some wrote invisible letters, tracing words onto their palms at night. A name, a sentence, a memory from home. It wasn't communication. It was preservation, of identity, of language, of self. A few turned their backs to the world, closed their eyes, and cooked imaginary meals. They served their mothers stews, their wives bread. Their children's laughter echoed silently through bunk walls. Others imagined entire days. Sunlight, trees, voices, scene by scene, breath by breath. When a man can picture the curve of a road he hasn't walked in years, he hasn't been captured completely. Some told stories to each other, whispers in the dark, stories they invented or remembered or rebuilt from broken pieces of memory. In those moments, the wire disappeared, the guards vanished. The cold lost its edge, and even when it returned, they had proof it wasn't all there was. Because real escape was never just about distance, it was about reclaiming something the camp couldn't touch. The mind, the will, the last part of a person that barbed wire couldn't bind. No tools, no maps, just memory, sharp enough to cut through stale. They stayed, but they didn't surrender. They slept in straw, but dreamed of streets. They stood still, but never stopped moving. Because some escapes leave no footprints, and some victories come without doors. Number 5, escape was mostly mental. In the harsh logic of prison camps, physical escape was nearly impossible. Fences stood tall, watchtowers never blinked. The ground was frozen, the air thin with fear. But some prisoners found a way out, without ever leaving. Escape, for them, became something internal, a quiet rebellion that lived inside the skull. When the body was caged, the only frontier left was the mind. They built entire routines in thought, morning walks down roads they'd never walk again, dinners laid out in invisible kitchens, voices of wives and children, clear, warm, repeated, like mantras in the dark. These weren't dreams. They were rehearsals for the life they refused to forget. Men preserved their sanity by refusing to live in the present. Instead, they returned to memory, visiting old towns, recalling smells of home-cooked meals, rebuilding the details of a uniform once worn with pride. Each recollection sharpened identity, keeping it from being erased. Others found escape in control, counting bricks, tracing cracks in bunk walls, memorizing the rhythm of guard boots. If the world outside was chaos, their internal world became order, a small kingdom where they ruled, even if no one else could see it. Some wrote in their heads, entire novels, poems, letters never sent, but mentally revised every night. Language became armor, thought became space. And when it got worse, when the cold bit deeper, when the silence screamed louder, they dug deeper inward. One man reconstructed the floor plan of his family home, down to each nail and creaking stair. Another replayed conversations from years ago, word for word, so that nothing, no detail, was surrendered to the wire. There were prisoners who went blind from illness, yet still described sunsets. Others who hadn't eaten in days, but tasted the sea just by closing their eyes. These were not delusions. They were defenses. Not escaping from reality, escapes into something more real than the camp itself. Because even in confinement, choice still existed. To remember instead of forget. To build instead of break. To carry something that no guard could ever touch. The distance between collapse and clarity was measured not in footsteps, but in thought. And in that mental space, they found a kind of freedom more powerful than gates, dogs, or guns. Number 6, work meant survival until it didn't. Inside prison camps, labor wasn't optional. It was the line between bread and nothing, between cold straw and a spot near the stove, between being seen and being discarded. Work gave a man a reason to be counted. If your name was on the labor list, you mattered, you moved, you were fed, barely. But that ration, no matter how thin, meant another day. At first, men clung to their tasks like lifelines, digging, hauling, building, anything to show the guards they were useful. Utility bought time. Obedience bought breath. But then the hours grew longer, the food thinner, and the tasks more brutal. Work stopped being survival. It started becoming a sentence. Falling behind meant punishment. Stopping meant beatings. Some collapsed where they stood, not because they gave up, but because their bodies couldn't obey anymore. And still, they were dragged back into the line. There were men who faked strength, tightening belts around ribs to look less starved. Some smeared ash on their cheeks to hide the sunken look, because appearing weak meant being cut, removed from the roster, left behind, forgotten. One prisoner swept the same stretch of ground for hours with no purpose, not to clean, just to be seen as working. Another built the same wall 3 times over, because knocking it down and starting again kept him on the labor list. Work became theater, a grim performance, staged for survival. But there came a point when the body couldn't carry the act anymore. Hands shook, legs faltered, eyes blurred, and that's when work betrayed them. The very thing that once saved their lives now dragged them closer to death, because when a man was no longer useful, he became invisible. And in camps like these, invisibility was a death sentence. Some begged to stay in the details. Some offered their boots, their coats, their last crumbs of food, anything to stay moving, to stay noticed. Others hid their injuries, wrapped bleeding hands in cloth so tight it cut circulation, just to show up the next day. Work was never about production. It was about proof. Proof you could still stand, still lift, still matter, until the moment you couldn't. And then the silence closed in. Number 7, disease lurked in every step. In a prison camp, there was no money, no stores, no market, but trade still happened. Every day, every hour, because when everything else was stripped away, rank, uniform, name, only one thing was left to trade: your body. Boots became more valuable than food, not because they could be sold, but because they could keep a man working one more shift, standing in one more roll call. A man with 2 good boots might trade one for a crust of bread, and sometimes the bread was moldy. It didn't matter. Jackets with lining were hoarded like gold, not for warmth, but for the pockets hidden inside. That space alone could carry crumbs, dry matches, or a stolen needle. And a single needle meant someone would sew for you, patch your shirt, fix your wounds, for a price. But it wasn't just clothing. Wounds themselves became a kind of currency. A man with an infected foot might be excused from labor if the guards believed it was real. Some prisoners reopened old injuries just enough to limp. Others pressed sharp stones into bruises, hoping for swelling that looked convincing. It was a risk, but in a place where pain already ruled, it became a tactic. Teeth were another story. Some men sold their gold fillings to guards, hoping for extra rations. Others pulled them out quietly, bartering with prisoners who still had influence. It wasn't about vanity. It was about one more bowl of soup. Even hair became a resource. A razor, traded for warmth or food, could keep lice away for a few more days. That alone was worth everything. And then came the choices no one talked about. The ones where dignity was traded, not for days, but for minutes. A stronger man might offer protection in return for silence. A weaker one might give up something more. No one judged. No one spoke. Because in those camps, morality bent under the weight of survival. You didn't give away your body because you wanted to. You gave it away because nothing else was left, and somehow, despite the shame, the hunger, the quiet trades done in corners, they endured. The body carried the weight. The body paid the price, and in the end, it was the only thing they truly owned. Number 8. The morning count meant everything. The sun hadn't risen, but they were already standing. Every morning, no matter the weather, no matter how many died in the night, the count came first. Guards marched through the camp with wooden boards and lists, cold, impersonal, exact. It didn't matter if snow blanketed the ground or if the wind howled like a curse. Every prisoner had to stand. Every body had to be seen. If a man couldn't stand, others lifted him. If he'd died hours earlier, sometimes they'd prop his body up, just for a few seconds more. Because the count wasn't just ritual, it was survival. Being marked present meant the rations would come. Miss it, and you disappeared from the list. And once your name vanished from the board, it rarely came back. They called it Apple, but it felt like judgment. Rows of shivering men, barely clothed, feet swollen from frostbite, shoulders locked in silence. No one dared speak. No one moved. Even a twitch could earn a blow from a rifle butt. Even coughing was a risk. Some fainted, others clenched their jaws and stayed upright through sheer will. It wasn't about strength anymore. It was about something deeper, a commitment to not fall. To be counted not just by the guards, but by the men next to you. You mattered if you stood. There were days when the count went wrong. A number was off. A name not answered. The whole camp would be held, sometimes for hours, under sleet or brutal heat, until the mistake was resolved. It didn't matter if the missing man was already dead or buried in a shallow trench. Everyone paid the price. Men learned to memorize not only their own number, but the numbers of those on either side. If someone was sick, the man next to him might answer in his place. It was dangerous, but it was loyalty. For some, the count became a kind of ritual, a moment to reclaim control, even in powerlessness. Each day you stood there, counted, stared down by a uniform with a clipboard, was one more day you had not vanished. And there were stories, quiet, never confirmed, of men who waited until the morning count, and then slipped away in the dark, leaving behind empty boots, folded blankets, and a gap in the line. But most didn't try, because to disappear wasn't always escape. Sometimes just being seen meant you were still alive. They weren't heroes in their own eyes. They were just men, cold, starving, broken, trying to hold on to something human in places designed to erase it. They didn't write books. They didn't ask for statues. What they left behind was quieter fragments, a method to hide bread, a rhythm to signal safety, a way to survive one more hour in a place where hours were never promised. What you've just heard aren't tactics from a training manual. They're survival codes written in frost, hunger, and silence. And yet, these men endured, not because they were stronger, but because they adapted, because they passed secrets in whispers, because they found warmth where there was none, because they remembered who they were, even when the world tried to forget them. These stories matter, not because they're dramatic, but because they're real. Every trick, every ritual, every stolen moment of breath was part of a hidden war waged quietly behind barbed wire and boots. And if we forget them, if we let these truths fade, then the silence wins. But you're still here, which means their memory still breathes. So if even one detail in this video shook you, if one moment made you pause and think of someone who endured what no human should, then don't let this story end here. Subscribe now, not for us, for them, because silence should never bury survival, and memory is the last weapon we still hold.